He helped write the sound of a generation. But when his life ended, there were no headlines, no cameras, just silence in an empty Detroit house. Once, the halls of Motown echoed with his laughter, his pen giving life to songs sung by legends like Marvin Gaye and a young Michael Jackson. Yet somehow, the man behind those melodies faded into the shadows, his name barely whispered outside the studio walls. How does someone who gave so much to music vanish so completely? How does the brother of Diana Ross end up forgotten by the very world he helped inspire? This is not a story about fame. It's a story about the cost of it. Let's get into the story of Arthur T-Boy Ross. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Grab a warm drink, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Arthur Ross was born on the 28th of February 1949 in Detroit, Michigan, a city pulsing with rhythm, sweat, and the sound of ambition. Long before it was known as the Motor City, Detroit was the birthplace of dreams for countless African-American families seeking a better life. The Ross family was one of them. Fred and Ernestine Ross were hard-working parents raising 6 children in the Brewster Douglas housing projects, a tough but vibrant community. The streets were crowded, the air smelled of gasoline and soul food, and on summer nights, music floated from every open window. Inside that small apartment, young Arthur, nicknamed T-Boy, began to sense that music wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. His older sister, Diane, later known to the world as Diana Ross, was already chasing her own dream with a girl group called the Primettes. Arthur watched her rehearse in the living room, harmonizing to old doo-wop records, while he scribbled lyrics on scraps of paper. He wasn't trying to compete. He was trying to belong to that same light, that same dream that seemed to lift his sister above the city's noise. As a child, T-Boy was shy yet quick-witted. Teachers described him as imaginative but distracted, his mind wandering toward melodies rather than math. He'd skip school to hang around neighborhood musicians, fascinated by the way they turned heartache into harmony. Detroit in the 1950s and 60s was a city divided by race and opportunity, but Motown, that new label on West Grand Boulevard, promised a way out, a path from the projects to the world. By his teens, T-Boy had begun writing songs of his own. His lyrics spoke about love, regret, and the ache of growing up poor but hopeful. His sisters teased him, but Diana saw something in him, a quiet hunger, the same kind she carried when she first stepped on stage. Family meant everything to them, but so did the dream of leaving the projects behind. When Diana's career took off with the Supremes, the family's life changed. They moved to a better neighborhood, and for the first time, T-Boy saw what success could look like. But even as his sister became a superstar, he struggled to find his place in the shadow of her spotlight. He admired her, loved her, yet felt invisible next to her fame. He spent his nights writing, his days drifting. Friends recalled him as magnetic but restless, charming but haunted. He could light up a room one moment and withdraw into silence the next. Alcohol and drugs started to circle his world early on, feeding the chaos that both inspired and consumed him. Detroit shaped him, its grit, its rhythm, its contradictions. It was a city where beauty and pain lived side by side, and T-Boy carried both inside him. By the time the 1970 arrived, his sister's fame was global. For Arthur, the dream was still uncertain, but the door to Motown, the house that built legends, was about to open for him too. Before the red carpets, before the heartbreak, there was just a boy from Detroit, writing about a love he hadn't yet found, and a world he was still trying to understand. By the early 1970s, Motown had moved from Detroit to Los Angeles. The label that once defined the sound of Black America was chasing a bigger dream, Hollywood. Diana Ross, now one of the most recognizable names in music, was part of that evolution, and she wanted her younger brother to have a place in it. T-Boy arrived in Los Angeles carrying more than a suitcase. He carried the weight of expectation, the belief that if Diana could conquer the world, maybe there was space for him too. His sister used her influence not to hand him success, but to give him a chance. She connected him with producer and songwriter Leon Ware, a creative soul who believed that music should feel like conversation, sensual, honest, and human. Ware saw in T-Boy a kindred spirit, raw, emotional, and unfiltered. Together they began writing songs that spoke not to fame, but to feeling. They weren't trying to make hits, they were trying to make truth. In 1972, a young Michael Jackson recorded I Want to Be Where You Are, a smooth, heartfelt song co-written by T-Boy and Leon Ware. The lyrics captured longing and innocence in a way only a 14-year-old Jackson could deliver. Few listeners knew the name Arthur Ross printed in small letters beneath the title, but that melody carried his soul into millions of homes. Success came quietly, almost secretly. The checks started coming in, and so did the validation. Yet, even as his name appeared in liner notes, T-Boy was restless. He wasn't built for the politics of the industry. He preferred small rooms, smoky studios, and late-night jam sessions where music still felt like art, not product. His next big collaboration came with Marvin Gaye, another complex genius whose life was as turbulent as his music was transcendent. With Leon Ware again at his side, T-Boy helped craft what would become one of Marvin's most intimate albums, I Want You, 1976. The project was steeped in sensuality, vulnerability, and the bittersweet ache of desire. The title track, I Want You, was pure chemistry, Marvin's voice gliding over the rhythm that T-Boy helped shape. It wasn't just a song, it was an atmosphere, a confession. But inside those studio walls, tension grew. Ware and T-Boy had created much of the music before Marvin entered the picture. When Motown's founder Berry Gordy decided Marvin should record it instead, credit and control became complicated. During one of the sessions, T-Boy criticized Marvin's delivery, a move few dared to make. He was removed from the session shortly after. It was one of those invisible Hollywood moments that change everything without anyone noticing. To the world, Marvin Gaye's I Want You became a masterpiece. To T-Boy, it became a reminder that even brilliance can be borrowed and sometimes forgotten. He didn't argue publicly. He didn't fight for recognition. He just withdrew, quietly, into himself. His collaborators admired him, but they also saw the shadows deepening. He was proud of his work, but pride couldn't quiet the feeling that he was once again standing behind someone else's light. For a brief moment, the world had touched his name and then let it go. But before the silence came, T-Boy still had one more dream to chase. A voice of his own, a record under his name. A chance to finally be seen not as Diana's brother or Marvin's co-writer, but as Arthur T-Boy Ross. By 1978, Arthur T-Boy Ross had spent years behind studio doors, helping others shine. But somewhere between the sessions and the shadows, he began to feel the quiet ache of invisibility. For all the songs he'd written, none had ever carried his voice. He started talking about making his own record, not just writing for others, but singing, producing, creating something that carried his own name on the cover. People around him were cautious. The industry could be cruel, especially to those who stepped out of their comfort zone. But for T-Boy, the idea of not trying felt even more unbearable. Motown had changed by then. The 1970s were giving way to a new sound. Funk, disco, and polished R&B dominated the airwaves. T-Boy didn't want to chase trends. He wanted to create something timeless. He teamed up again with his longtime collaborators Leon Ware, Joe Sample, and Billy Brown, crafting an album called Changes. The title was prophetic. For T-Boy, life was indeed changing, a fragile mix of hope and desperation. The sessions were long and intimate. He poured into those songs everything he hadn't said in years: the loneliness, the need for love, the weight of his family's fame, and the dream of being seen as his own man. Among the tracks was To the Baby, a tender song written for his sister Diana, dedicated to her daughters Rhonda and Tracy. It was both a gift and a message, a reminder that despite the distance between them, he still loved his family deeply. The song felt like a quiet apology wrapped in melody. When Changes was released in 1979, T-Boy believed it would finally shift his life. He dressed sharp, smiled for small interviews, and waited for the calls that never came. Critics barely noticed. The album sold only about 12,000 copies. In a world obsessed with hits, Changes barely made a sound. For Motown, it was just another commercial disappointment. For T-Boy, it was personal. The record wasn't just a project, it was his redemption, his voice finally out in the open. And when the world ignored it, he took it as a sign that maybe his time had already passed. He still had admirers. Musicians respected his writing, and his friends said he carried himself with quiet grace. But inside, something broke. The hunger that once pushed him forward began to fade. The more the music world moved on, the more T-Boy pulled back. In interviews from that period, he spoke about wanting peace, not fame. "I just want to live and let the music breathe," he once said to a close friend. But in reality, peace was hard to find. The same city that once celebrated Motown's glory was now drifting into economic decay, and so was the soul of one of its own. When changes failed to take off, Arthur retreated. He stopped writing, he stopped recording, he stopped believing. The spotlight that had once touched him briefly disappeared, leaving behind a man still searching for meaning. He had chased the dream long enough to know what it cost. And soon, that cost would become too heavy to bear. For a fleeting moment, Arthur T-Boy Ross stood where every songwriter dreams of standing in the company of legends, surrounded by melodies that would last forever. Even if his own name wasn't famous, his fingerprints were all over the music that defined an era. The mid to late 1970 were golden years for soul and R&B. The world was dancing to songs T-Boy helped shape, even if they didn't know it. Marvin Gaye's "I Want You" became an anthem of desire, its warmth and sensuality reshaping how intimacy was expressed in black music. Michael Jackson's "I Want to Be Where You Are" had already proven that T-Boy could capture innocence and longing in a few simple lines. To insiders at Motown, Arthur was known as the quiet craftsman, the one who understood emotion better than fame. He didn't crave red carpets or headlines. What he wanted most was respect, the kind that came when another artist said, "That lyric, that's real." In Los Angeles, the scene was alive. Studio musicians moved like family, and nights blurred into mornings filled with tape reels and cigarette smoke. T-Boy's creativity thrived there. He wrote not for attention, but because he had something to say. His songs weren't just catchy, they were human. He could sit at a piano for hours, coaxing a feeling into words. Leon Ware once described him as the guy who could find the heart inside a chord. Together, they created pieces that were both soulful and cinematic music that moved slowly, like a confession. When Changes was released, even with its modest numbers, it still marked the moment T-Boy became his own artist. He wasn't hiding behind anyone anymore. The album blended jazz, soul, and quiet introspection, the kind of record critics might have called ahead of its time if they had listened closely. Songs like "To the Baby" revealed a gentleness rare in male artists of that era. It wasn't performative, it was personal. Every lyric carried the ache of someone who had seen too much and still believed in love. To those who knew him, that was T-Boy, complicated, sensitive, full of contradictions. For a while, things seemed hopeful again. Royalty checks from his earlier hits were still coming in. He had friends in both Detroit and Los Angeles, and every now and then, someone would recognize his name in the credits of a classic Motown record. In small, quiet ways, his art was still alive. But in Hollywood, fame is a fragile thing. One season, the phone rings non-stop. The next, silence. T-Boy's music carried a depth that didn't always fit the fast-paced energy of the 1980. The sound of Motown was evolving, moving toward synths and glossy production. His kind of soul, raw, honest, poetic, was fading from the charts. Still, for a brief window, Arthur Ross was part of something eternal. He had written for icons, recorded his own album, and lived a life that touched the soul of American music. When he looked around the studio, he could feel it, the same electricity that had once surrounded Diana, Marvin, and Michael. He was part of that lineage, even if history wouldn't always say his name. He didn't know it yet, but this would be his brightest hour, the calm before the quiet, the moment when the music still played, and the world, for once, seemed to listen. For most artists, success brings light. But for Arthur T-Boy Ross, the light began to cast longer shadows. The very world that had once embraced him, the studios, the laughter, the late-night sessions, started to feel distant, almost unreal. After the release of Changes, the silence that followed was louder than applause. Motown moved on quickly, chasing new trends, new faces, new profits. T-Boy's name stopped appearing on track listings. The phone calls slowed, then stopped altogether. At first, he told himself it was temporary. Every artist had slow seasons. He'd find his way back. But beneath that optimism lived a quiet ache, the feeling that the world had already turned the page. Friends from that time described him as present, but fading. He'd show up to gatherings with that same charming smile, talk about music, even hum new ideas. But when it was time to record, he'd hesitate. The confidence that once came so naturally now seemed fragile. The pressure of being Diana's brother weighed heavier than ever. Wherever he went, her name followed a blessing and a curse. He loved his sister deeply, but he also felt trapped in her reflection. When people looked at him, they didn't see Arthur Ross. They saw Diana's shadow. He started drinking more. What began as a way to relax turned into a way to forget. Detroit was changing, too. The once proud city that had given birth to Motown was now slipping into decline. Abandoned factories, boarded-up houses, and lost jobs mirrored the emptiness growing inside him. In interviews from that era, Diana often spoke about family, love, and staying grounded. Privately, she worried about her brother. She tried to help, offering support, connections, even studio time. But addiction is a quiet thief. It doesn't knock. It slips in through the cracks of disappointment and stays until there's nothing left to steal. By the early 1980s, T-Boy had all but vanished from the public eye. He still visited Detroit from time to time, staying with family, writing in notebooks that no one would ever read. The royalties from his songs provided enough to live on, but not enough to save him from himself. The people who knew him best said he was gentle, too gentle for the industry's sharp edges. Fame, for him, was never a goal. It was an accident. He wanted art, not attention. But when the art stopped giving him purpose, the world felt too quiet. In the silence that followed, he began to withdraw. Calls went unanswered. Letters were left unopened. He stopped writing, stopped singing, stopped believing that music could still save him. It's a familiar story in Hollywood, a dream that burns too brightly, only to dim before anyone notices. But in T-Boy's case, the tragedy wasn't just that he was forgotten by the public. It was that he began to forget himself. He once said to a friend, "When the songs stop coming, you start to wonder if maybe they were the only thing keeping you alive." No one knew how true that would become. The seeds of his downfall were never dramatic, just small, quiet moments of giving up, moments that built, one after another, until the music was gone. And when the music left, so did he, slowly, silently, until the world no longer noticed he was missing. By the mid-1980s, Arthur T-Boy Ross had drifted far from the bright rooms of Motown. The industry that once embraced him barely remembered his name. The royalties that once sustained him grew smaller each year, and the loneliness grew larger. He split his time between Los Angeles and Detroit, two cities that represented both his dreams and his decline. In Los Angeles, he could blend into the noise, just another face among forgotten artists. In Detroit, the ghosts of what once was seemed to whisper from every street corner. Those who saw him in his final years said he was still kind, still funny when he wanted to be. But his eyes carried exhaustion, the kind that comes from chasing something you can no longer see. Music had once been his way out of pain. Now, it was a reminder of everything he'd lost. The success of his sister Diana continued to grow. She toured the world, starred in films, and became a global symbol of grace and perseverance. Arthur was proud of her, deeply proud, but also quietly resentful of his own place in her story. To the world, he was Diana Ross's brother, nothing more. Addiction took root slowly. Friends said he used alcohol and drugs not to feel high, but to feel numb. It wasn't about rebellion, it was about escape. The same sensitivity that made him a great songwriter made him vulnerable to the weight of life. He'd return to Detroit often, visiting his sister Rita and reconnecting with childhood friends. Sometimes, he'd stay in the old neighborhood, sitting on porches late into the night, reminiscing about the early Motown days when everything felt possible. But those moments of warmth never lasted. By morning, reality would return. The world had changed, and so had he. There were small attempts to rebuild a few writing sessions here and there, conversations about maybe recording again, but they always fell apart. The industry had moved on to new sounds, new names. The soulful vulnerability of artists like Arthur had no place in the polished landscape of 1980 pop. Bills piled up. Legal troubles followed. By the early 1990s, he faced minor charges for drug possession, a sign of how far he had fallen. Yet even then, he tried to keep his dignity. He never begged for help. He just retreated further into silence. Family members grew worried but didn't always know how to reach him. Addiction creates distant, invisible walls that even love can't break through. Diana wrote to him, called when she could, but he avoided confrontation. He didn't want pity. He just wanted peace. By 1996, Arthur's world had grown very small. He was living back in Detroit with his partner, Patricia Robinson. They kept mostly to themselves, rarely seen by neighbors. There were no headlines, no studio sessions, no signs of a comeback, just two people trying to survive in a city that had long since forgotten their names. For someone who had once helped give the world its soundtrack, the silence was unbearable. And yet, that's how his story was moving toward silence, toward the moment when no one would even notice he was gone. He didn't know it yet, but the final chapter of his life was already being written, not in the studio, but in the shadows of Detroit, the same city that had birthed both his dream and his downfall. The end came quietly, not with headlines, not with tributes, but with silence. In late May of 1996, neighbors in a small Detroit neighborhood noticed a strange smell coming from a rundown house on Oak Park. Inside, police would discover the decomposing bodies of Arthur T-Boy Ross and his partner, Patricia Robinson. Both had been chained and gagged, the victims of what investigators described as a brutal suffocation. The news barely made the local papers. There were no national headlines, no retrospectives on his contributions to music. For most of the world, Arthur Ross had already disappeared long before that day. He was only 47 years old. Patricia was 54. They had been gone for weeks before anyone realized. No family member had reported him missing. By the time authorities found them, the story had already begun to fade. The official report listed their deaths as a homicide. Yet, to this day, much of what happened inside that small house remains a mystery. Who did it and why was never fully clear. What was clear, however, was the tragedy of it all. A man who once helped shape the sound of Motown had died forgotten, his last days spent in isolation and fear. T-Boy had been scheduled to appear in court just days later for minor drug charges. But that hearing would never happen. The city that once lifted him up had turned into a place of danger, decay, and despair. In many ways, Detroit's decline mirrored his own, the music fading, the lights dimming, the beauty buried beneath time and neglect. When news of his death reached Diana Ross, she was on tour in Japan. She couldn't attend the funeral, but she wrote a letter that her daughter Tracy read aloud during the service. Her words were raw and honest. "It breaks my heart. Why did you make the choices you made in your life? I cannot blame you for your imperfections, T-Boy. I do, however, blame this drug-infested world of today." Those words carried the weight of both love and regret, a sister mourning not just her brother, but the dream he once held. The funeral was small. A few family members, a handful of old friends, some Motown colleagues who remembered his laughter. There was no grand tribute, no televised farewell, just quiet goodbyes and the faint echo of songs that once filled the air with joy. In a different world, perhaps his story might have ended differently. Perhaps he would have found peace, or redemption, or at least the recognition he deserved. But life doesn't always reward talent sometimes. It only remembers the loudest voices. Arthur Ross wasn't loud. He was gentle. He gave the world melodies that still live today, but when his own song ended, almost no one heard it. The tragedy of T-Boy Ross isn't only how he died, it's how easily the world moved on. The headlines focused on scandals, stars, and spectacle. But no one stopped to ask how a man who helped define Motown's sound could vanish into such silence. His story remains one of the quietest tragedies in music history, a reminder that genius isn't always celebrated and that some of the brightest lights fade long before the world is ready to notice. And yet, even in that silence, his music endured. Because somewhere, every time Marvin Gaye's "I Want You" plays, or Michael Jackson's "I Want to Be Where You Are" fills a room, Arthur T-Boy Ross is still there, unseen, unheard, but undeniably present. Years after his death, the name Arthur T-Boy Ross still lingers quietly in the margins of Motown's story. He may not be in the photographs hanging on studio walls or in the documentaries celebrating the label's golden years, but his fingerprints are everywhere in the melodies, the moods, and the emotions that defined a generation. His songs were never about spectacle. They were about feeling. When he co-wrote I Want You with Leon Ware, he wasn't just writing for Marvin Gaye, he was writing for anyone who had ever wanted something so deeply that it hurt. The song became an anthem of intimacy, a blueprint for what soul music could be, honest, vulnerable, and timeless. Then there was I Want to Be Where You Are, recorded by a teenage Michael Jackson. Decades later, that song still stands as one of the most tender moments in Jackson's early career, a moment that captured innocence with surprising maturity. T-Boy's lyrics made it possible for listeners to feel both joy and longing in the same breath. Those songs became part of the American songbook, even if few realized whose heart had written them. That was T-Boy's gift to move people without demanding credit. His work taught an entire generation of songwriters that emotion mattered more than image. In the years following his death, his music found new life. Modern artists began sampling and reinterpreting his melodies. R&B singers like D'Angelo, Maxwell, and Alicia Keys drew inspiration from the lush sensuality of I Want You. Neo-soul, the genre that bridged classic Motown with modern intimacy, owes part of its DNA to Arthur Ross. Music historians often describe him as the invisible hand behind the Motown sound's second act, the era where soul became more personal, more confessional. While the world celebrated performers, T-Boy represented the quiet architects who built those stages from behind the curtain. Even his only solo album, Changes, found a second life among collectors and vinyl lovers. Over the years, it has been rediscovered as a hidden gem, its warmth, its honesty, and its melancholy resonating more today than when it was first released. On platforms like YouTube and Spotify, fans who stumble upon his music often comment the same thing: how did I never hear this before? For every forgotten artist, there comes a moment of rediscovery, not in headlines, but in whispers. And that's what's happening with Arthur Ross. His influence isn't measured in awards or fame, but in echoes, in the way a lyric still feels true, or how a chord progression still breaks your heart decades later. His legacy reminds us that music doesn't need the world's approval to matter. It only needs one listener who feels seen in it. To those who know, T-Boy Ross represents the soul of Motown's unsung, the creators who wrote history but never got to live inside it. His story is the quiet proof that greatness doesn't always shine from the stage. Sometimes it hides in the background, humming softly in the dark, waiting to be remembered. And perhaps that's the truest form of legacy, not to be famous, but to be felt. In the years since his passing, the story of Arthur T-Boy Ross has become more than a tragedy. It has become a reflection, a mirror held up to the way the music industry treats its quiet geniuses. For many years, his name existed only in liner notes, his story buried beneath those of the artists he helped make famous. But time has a way of revealing what fame forgets. Slowly, listeners began to look deeper, reading the credits, tracing melodies back to their source. And there, written in small print, they found him Arthur Ross. Diana Ross has rarely spoken publicly about her brother's death, but when she has, her words have carried both sorrow and grace. She once said in an interview that T-Boy had a heart too big for this world. It wasn't just a figure of speech. Those who knew him said he cared too deeply, felt too much, and lived in a world that often rewarded the opposite. Among musicians, his name still brings a quiet nod of respect. Leon Ware, before his own passing, often credited T-Boy for shaping the intimacy and emotion that defined I Want You. Arthur understood pain, Ware once said. He could translate it into something beautiful. That's what remains of him now, beauty. Not the fame, not the fortune, not the headlines, but the humanity inside his song. His life might have ended in tragedy, but his art continues to live, and in that art, he's still speaking to us. Today, when fans rediscover his music, they often describe the same feeling, nostalgia, mixed with disbelief. They ask, how could someone this talented be forgotten? It's a question without a simple answer, and maybe that's the point. His story forces us to look at how we define success. Was he a failure because the world forgot his name? Or was he a success because, decades later, we're still moved by his work? In every generation, there are artists like Arthur Ross, people who give their whole selves to their craft, but never get the recognition they deserve. They are the backbone of culture, the quiet creators behind the stars. Without them, the legends we celebrate would not exist. T-Boy's music reminds us that art is not about survival in the charts, but survival in memory. His story urges us to slow down, to listen more closely, and to honor those who gave everything, even when the world gave nothing back. He didn't get a Hollywood star. He didn't get awards or magazine covers, but he left behind something purer: songs that still breathe, stories that still ache, and a spirit that refuses to fade. For those who remember, Arthur T-Boy Ross isn't gone. He's just playing somewhere quieter where the music never stops, and where, finally, he doesn't have to compete to be heard. The story of Arthur T-Boy Ross is not just about loss, it's about the quiet brilliance that too often goes unnoticed. He was the brother of a legend, the pen behind timeless songs, and the voice that never got to be fully heard. But through the rise and fall, through fame and obscurity, one truth remains. He gave the world a part of himself that can never die. Detroit has changed since the days when Motown ruled its streets. The factories are quieter now, and the studios that once echoed with soul have turned into museums. But somewhere in that silence, you can still hear the music: faint, distant, eternal, the same music that Arthur helped create. He may have left this world without applause, but his songs continue to play in the background of our lives in the way Marvin Gaye made us feel, in the way Michael Jackson made us dream, and in the way Diana Ross reminded us to love. Sometimes history forgets the names that built its foundation, but remembering them, saying their names, telling their stories, is how we give them back their light. Arthur's story reminds us that every melody has a maker, every song has a soul, and every forgotten artist deserves to be remembered. So tonight, if you find yourself listening to "I Want You" or "I Want to Be Where You Are," take a moment to think about the man who helped create them, the man who wrote not for fame, but for truth. Do you think the music world ever gave Arthur T-Boy Ross the respect he deserved? If this story moved you, subscribe to Stars Underrated and help us keep these memories alive. Share this video, leave a comment, and tell us which forgotten artist deserves their story told next. Because some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see.